Welcome to another episode of the Space Salvi Institute podcast. I'm Bobby Mixa.
And I'm Andrew Petiprin.
Well, what brings us together today is a piece that Andrew recently wrote that you can find on our website called NATO and a deeper Western unity. Um, and so Andrew and I, we thought we'd actually talk about this because there's so much we're filming this actually in February, beginning of February. But in January, there was just a bunch of stuff going on with the Davos conference and all the stuff about Greenland. So this was a big topic in the news. And Andrew, you just sent me this piece, which I was like very, pleased to see you write about this. But you get at some really deep questions in this piece. So let's just start off, Andrew. Maybe you could tell us what like inspired you to write the piece and to delve into some of these questions.
Yeah, well, first of all, forgive me, listeners, for the quality of my voice right now. Like so many people, I'm getting over a cold at this time of year. I don't like winter, and I think my body is just revolting against it. But anyway, yeah, I decided to write this. Why did I decide to write this? Well, first of all, it should be said that we're not a current events podcast, website, organization, nor are we just a kind of international affairs journal or, whatever. But we are very interested in culture and very interested in the West as a concept and as more than a concept, as a um, kind of as a unified, in some way, unified group of nations that kind of share a cultural heritage that we believe could be the basis for a renewal of those cultures. Obviously, there are differences among them, and obviously there are influences exerted upon all those different nations that aren't going to be the same in every place. Obviously, in the United States, we have like a whole set of factors that are just not the same as Great Britain or Poland or Italy or something like that. So there are a lot of differences, but there's also just a lot of similarity. And so for me, NATO has always been something that's fascinated me. And I've talked before on this podcast about the fact that my grandfather was a naval officer and he was a naval attaché for NATO after World War II in Paris before France withdrew from NATO before many years later rejoining. But they withdrew for a while in the mid 60s and kicked NATO headquarters out of Paris, where it ended up landing in Belgium. And then my father, who was also a naval officer, served with NATO in the war in the former Yugoslavia in the late 1990s or the mid 1990s. So I've just always been interested in that and interested in the idea of the West and of Western nations and sort of what that looks like in a practical way. With NATO, it obviously has to do with defense, with military and that kind of thing. And so if you remember, growing up, Bobby, before the end of the Cold War, um, if you ever knew anybody who had been in the army, for example, in the American army, there was a fairly good chance that they had served in Europe, that they had served probably in Germany, because that's where the majority of our Europe-based troops were, and in fact, that's still where most of our Europe-based troops are. At the height of the Cold War, we had about 400,000 American military personnel stationed there, not counting their families and civilian personnel and stuff like that. So a lot of people. Now we have about 100,000, and half of them are at Ramstein Air Base or in the vicinity of Kaiserslautern in the Rhineland Pfalz. So there's still a lot of Americans there, and it's still very much kind of a part of our like military heritage since World War II. Now, the reason I decided to write the article is just I follow these things closely. Whenever there's a kind of fight going on among NATO NATO allies about what the future of NATO might be, or whether there's strained tensions or something like that. And there have been a lot of those over the decades, by the way.
Yeah.
But
That's
most
important to keep
recently,
in mind. I mean, people think it's
yeah.
only a recent phenomenon, but like you mentioned in the 60s with France and then all in the Middle Eastern issues in the 70s and all of that.
Yeah, the Suez Crisis in the 50s,
Yeah.
a lot of disagreement among NATO nations about, I mean, the whole question really of the Soviet Union by the time you get to the 70s, right? Because by then it seems like, well, we're going to have this sort of détente. We're just going to decide to live together. We're just going to sort of figure this out somehow, right? And then Reagan comes along in the early 80s and says, absolutely not. We're
Yeah.
going to beat
Up
them.
up the volume again. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean there was a lot of strife about how that was going to play out, you know. Anyway, so there have been a lot of disagreements over the years, but you know, lately it's been strange, kind of on the American side and on the continental European side, because we've got on the one hand, as part of sort of the MAGA movement, there is a bit of a stronger isolationist wing on the right in American politics now than there was in recent times.
Mhm.
And there's a kind of renewed interest in the Monroe Doctrine and in, you know, never getting entangled again in these sort of military adventures and that kind of thing, supposedly. And yet, in practice, it's just not really the case. I mean, we're taking out the leadership of Venezuela. We're destroying the nuclear capabilities of Iran. You know, I mean, we're still because the United States is the great imperial power in the world, has the by far the strongest military of any country in the world. I mean, it acts, it does. I mean, that's just the way that it works, right? Now, on top of that, though, there has been all of this concern about Greenland, which again is not new. A lot of Americans don't realize that there have been a lot of attempts, or at least discussions on the western side of the Atlantic about the question of shouldn't America have Greenland? Because, you know, it's more or less in our sphere of influence. We have a navy powerful enough to really, you know, patrol it and control it and all of that sort of thing. But just by kind of historical accident going back to, you know, I don't know, the Vikings, you know, Denmark has it. Um, but, you know, at this stage, Denmark is our ally in NATO. And in
Yeah.
fact, Denmark's been a very good ally to the United States over the decades.
And
And
also
so,
you mentioned, wasn't there a treaty in the early 1900s that, American could get a couple, I forget exactly what the islands were in the Caribbean, and then Denmark, we'd guarantee Denmark to have Greenland. But that was in the
yeah.
early 1900s.
Yeah, and there are all kinds of like historical ins and outs related to all of these kinds of questions. But I mean, in recent times, not only are we allies with Denmark, but we have other agreements that we've made with Denmark with regard to Greenland. It's not all just covered by the North Atlantic Treaty. I mean, basically, Greenland gives us carte blanche. We can do whatever we want in Greenland,
Mhm, mhm.
from a kind of defense and strategic perspective, anyway. So, you know, anyway, needless to say, we don't need to go totally down that rabbit hole because, again, we're not a current events or international affairs podcast. But it has troubled me that this has become a kind of like contentious issue with our NATO allies, right? But not just this. I mean, when you listen to somebody like Ursula von der Leyen of the European Commission, I mean, you know, she's in no way interested in playing ball with MAGA or with President Trump. Unlike, frankly, most of the significant elected leaders of European countries. I mean, they've all made their peace with the fact that they're going to have to relate to the American president somehow, right? But the EU is like really trying to kind of carve out its own identity and is talking more about kind of independence from the United States and openness to the world, right? Whatever that means. And so I wanted to write this piece to kind of, I mean, first of all, like to express a sort of relief that it seems probably the NATO alliance is once again going to hold together, and that's a good thing, just like it has in times of disagreement in the past. But also to just kind of like make the point that there are areas where the NATO alliance might even be able to get stronger than it's been in the past. And I'm definitely one of those. I think you are too, Bobby. And sometimes we face disagreements with people, you know, with whom otherwise we are largely in sympathy politically on the question of NATO expansion. And I mean, I'm a big fan of the fact that there were a whole lot of countries after the Cold War, countries like Poland, countries like Hungary, countries like the Czech Republic, countries like Croatia, et cetera, that said, we're Western nations. We never wanted to be dominated by the Soviet Union. We're not in their sphere of influence. We belong with you. And we want to be protected by you, and not just be protected by you, but actually make sacrifices too. And so now we see a country like Poland that has upped its defense spending and that is becoming more and more of a power on the continent of Europe, and at the same time has expressed more and more of a willingness, at least at the top right now with the current president of Poland, to be a strong partner with the United States. And that to me is just very encouraging. Now, I'll say one more thing and then throw it back to you because there's probably a lot to say. We are ultimately very interested in the question of the role of the church, the role of the spirit, the life of the spirit, the life of the mind, all these kinds of things as not only like factors in our cultures, but the basis of our cultures, right? And something that is sometimes forgotten when we're talking about these like practical political matters and military alliances and things like that is that even NATO itself, now maybe they were just paying lip service to some kind of more spiritual reality.
Yeah.
But even NATO itself in 1949, in the founding treaty, mentioned, and I'm quoting here from the preamble, mentioned common heritage and civilization of their peoples. They talked about, the principles of democracy, individual liberty, and rule of law. But right there from the beginning was this sense that these nations that have bound themselves together have a common heritage.
Yeah.
And, other people like General Marshall, who won the Nobel Peace Prize as kind of the architect of the New West after World War II, even he talked in his Nobel speech about spiritual regeneration,
Mhm.
that there was some assumption. Maybe it wasn't the first card that was always being played at that time, but there was some assumption, even among the elites, that that banding ourselves together in these alliances was meant to serve ultimately some kind of larger purpose than just realpolitik, right? And that's something that I think is significant to us and to our project.
Absolutely, yeah. Let's stay with that realpolitik thing a little bit though, because you mentioned the spheres of influence with Greenland. And, you know, out here, with the crisis in the war in Ukraine and all of that, we don't need to reiterate the kind of history behind this, but sometimes the thinking there is that with great powers, they have this certain spheres of influence, and if you consider Russia still a great power, and you allow that kind of sphere of influence mentality to take hold, then it was like some like John Mesmizer. How do you ever say his name? John Mesmizer or whatever.
Mearsheimer?
Mearsheimer. Yeah, there we go.
Mhm.
Um, Sometimes you listen to all these YouTube videos and you never quite get the name right. So
Yeah, I do that all the
apologies.
time.
But there's kind of that realism, at least how they call it, of well, obviously, the minute you were suggesting Ukraine becoming part of NATO, and holding that hope out to them, Russia was going to respond. And so there's also then kind of the deeper question, like because yeah, NATO, anybody who would like to join the NATO alliance, that's part of it. So the spheres of influence thing comes up, and when people say, "Oh, well, Donald Trump is now kind of he has his instead of Monroe Doctrine, they call it Donroe Doctrine."
Yeah.
Um, is talking about this in terms of Venezuela and other things. Iran doesn't necessarily fit into that because it's not in the Western Hemisphere, but they say, well, then he's just going to basically, accommodate Putin in any way and make Ukraine just part of that sphere of influence. What do you say to people who like, emphasize, see this kind of as being a little bit hypocritical?
Yeah. Well, one thing that I don't know if you've noticed this, but I mean, I think now there is some, and maybe it's kind of more on the left and maybe more on the left in Europe. There's a little bit of an implication now that right wingers, especially in the United States, are kind of more sympathetic to Putin and Russia than they should be. And
Mhm.
there do certainly seem to be certain like sort of outliers, I would call them, really more than mainstream figures. But like there definitely are some significant figures who seem to be like that. And we've talked about this before, but I mean, Tucker Carlson, obviously, like going to Russia and like, making a fool of himself, in my opinion, like going to supermarkets and talking about how great Russia is and meeting with, what's his name? Alexander Dugin and,
Oh,
listening
I
to
forgot
this sort
about that.
of, listening to this just sort of totally in my opinion, just like bonkers mythology that that some of them have. But um, yeah, sorry, where was I going with this? Oh, but so I think, and maybe the Ursula von der Leyens of the world are like really, really concerned about this kind of question, right? And so then the European Union needs to kind of be much stronger apart from the United States, precisely because it doesn't know if it can trust the United States anymore on this question of what to make of Russia. I get that to some extent. However, let's again talk about the question of Poland, where I was watching the other day President Nawrocki in his visit to the United States whenever he first was elected or shortly after he was elected president in Poland. He came over to the United States and he was sitting in the Oval Office and they had a little press conference in there or something like that. And you know, he, it seems to me, was just very realistic about the fact that like Russia is nobody's friend, and Poland knows better than anybody that we're not going to just, lie down and let Russia have its little sphere of influence and let it have Ukraine and everything will be fine and none of our business or anything like that. Poland knows that better than anybody. And that's why I think it is so important and significant that Poland is also the one who's coming up and saying, we don't have any better friend in the world than the United States, right? Like Poland is able to, in a sense, like help people in the American sphere, I think, understand better, like that NATO still has this like fundamental mission to stand strong against frankly, like Russian imperialism to some degree, among other things. But that's important. Now, how that's all going to play out in like a peace process over how the war in Ukraine ends up, like who knows exactly? I don't know. But I mean, it may well be that Ukraine just can't end up joining NATO as one of the conditions of peace eventually. And I think that would be sad because I don't think there's any reason why Ukraine shouldn't join NATO if that's what they want to do. I mean, Russia has no kind of like inherent claim on their identity. But I don't know if I answered your question. I kind of got
Well,
off.
I mean, here, let's stick with that inherent
Okay.
claim on their identity. It's interesting, when you mentioned the Tucker Carlson video, and people kind of made fun of the fact that, Putin just went on talking about, the 1600s the whole time, in which, if you keep that in mind, I think it was in 1610, the Poles actually took Moscow. Most Poles, they all know that. And they say, Moscow, they did not, we took Moscow. It wasn't burnt down. Napoleon took it when it was burnt down. But anyways, and then later on, you have the issues in the 1600s. I mean, 1600s, by the way, it's fascinating just what was taking place then, early modernity. It's like so much of the world that we're still in came into being in the 1600s, with the 30 Years' War, with the deluge, with Sweden being a major superpower at that time, but then the Northern Wars, and then the emergence of Russia. But for them, he keeps talking about about when the Cossacks united, okay, with Muscovy, to fight off the kind of Polish, what they saw as the oppression of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and but also kind of giving this almost seamless history from Kievan Rus all the way to the emergence of Muscovy and the Tsar, and it's just so interesting because, like, for Americans, that history, I mean, as Henry Ford said, history is bunk. But this is very, as Czesław Miłosz said, history in this part of the world is just like in everything. Okay, so it's really you just even though it may be recent history compared to like some ancient civilizations like China and Egypt in Egypt and Greece, but it's just it's really it's in the air. So sometimes you have these histories that these histories that people will tell, and it's seemingly very close because they're called like the Rus, right? And Kievan Rus is baptized, and Russia sees itself as becoming a baptized nation in Kiev with Vladimir. But yet it's different. And to mention maybe if anybody wants to get into some of this, we did a interview with Eva Thompson. Now, some people are a little critical of Eva Thompson as being a little bit too seemingly like anti-Russian, but she really, I think, has a claim. to say that actually imperialism, it's not just kind of one little phase of Russian history. She sees it as in some maybe this is the Pole talking, but as kind of ingrained in the mentality. So, anyways, that's all to kind of say that the history is really important here, and I encourage everybody to kind of delve into this. And uh, I mean, we have what's his name, who's the famous American Timothy Snyder. He's a famous American historian. I can, to be honest, I can't really stand some of his books, and they're really not, in my opinion, like that good. But he's become this like celebrity of telling now the kind of the history of Ukraine, which I think he has a point to say, hey, wait a minute here, Kievan Rus isn't the same thing as what emerges in Muscovian. To conflate the two is just, yes, they're related, but they're just, it's not one seamless history.
Right, right. And Eva talked to us about that a bit too when she appeared on our podcast. And I definitely do recommend everybody go and watch that episode. She was dynamite. I mean, just the stuff, the insights that she shared. And by the way, Bobby, she is very critical of Russia. She's also very critical of Germany. And I mean, I think that's another issue that we're thinking about right now with regard to these questions of the Western alliance, right? Um, you know, I mentioned before that all of this American military presence got built up in Germany after World War II for obvious reasons. I mean, we essentially said to Germany, "Do you want to have a country?" And their answer was yes. And so the price was, this is where we're going to be, and that arrangement was fine for a long time, and it's still going. As I said, it's still going. However, Eva Thompson herself, I noticed this the other day. She said something in an X post about how Ramstein Air Base should be moved to Poland now.
Mhm.
Um, and the implication there is Germany, sure, Germany's still in NATO, obviously, or whatever, but I mean, do they really believe in this Western alliance anymore? Or do they have their own kind of, you know, in some strange way, some kind of like imperialist designs that it can't shake out of its system, sort of like Russia can't shake it out of its system. Now, I don't totally buy that. And obviously Eva being Polish and, a lot of history there about Germany and Russia dominating Poland, especially in recent times. Um, but I do think that's significant that you've got a German woman, Ursula von der Leyen, as the head of the European Commission, and then you've got the president of Poland. You've got, I mean, even Macron in France is like saying things that are, I mean, he's kind of frustrating, right? Because he's sort of, on the one hand, seems like such a Euro technocrat, and on the other hand,
The
is
sunglasses.
yeah, but on the other hand, is very independent minded and like very much about France first and stuff like that, which then creates interesting dynamics with the United States and other places too. So I don't know. Again, maybe I'm wading into water that's a little bit too deep here, but history is super important. And something maybe that would be interesting to our listeners on this question would be, before we started recording, you and I were talking about this book that you've read and you recommended to me, and I've been listening to in
Yeah.
the car, which is called The West by Georgios Varoufakis,
Mhm.
where he talks about kind of the just the emergence of this concept of the West and sort of how we get to a place in 2025, I guess, when the book was published, where we still have this like practical military alliance in the form of NATO. But where did that come from in history? And what does it mean in some kind of deeper cultural or spiritual sense, you know?
Yeah, and that the concept of the West is just how many debates. I didn't realize how many debates there are about that, and different kind of like understandings of it. To mention just somebody who some of our listeners might actually know a little bit about, Samuel Huntington, who actually is interesting. I didn't know he was influenced by Zbigniew. I'm going to butcher his last name, Brzezinski, okay,
Oh
who
yeah, yeah.
also influenced by Felix Konieczny, who is a famous, like almost, if you want to say, cultural historian, of the late 19th, early 20th century, who wrote a lot about this kind of understanding of civilizations and almost something like what Samuel Huntington then phrased the clash of civilizations. And if you look at like Huntington's way of actually breaking this all up, he includes, I think, he has like the Latin West, uh, Byzantium, and maybe some countries like even Ukraine would argue why they're not fully part of that just one monolithic culture with Russia. So there's room for disagreement, but it's interesting, when you talk to Poles and Felix Konieczny talks about Poland, even though it's a Slavic country, as being part of the Roman Catholic Church, as being really taking on that Latin civilization while still, obviously having a Slavic language and taking that on. It nevertheless had to prove itself to be kind of part of that Roman world. And, it's interesting, with when we talk about the West, how much of that is rooted in what D.C. Schindler calls that Christian synthesis of Jerusalem, Athens, and Rome. And really Rome kind of being like at the heart of it. So I mean, it's interesting, just like how the historical side of this informing these debates is just so important. And inevitably, with the histories that you're becoming part of, it does you ask the questions about like, well, what are the deep in a way values, and then also in some ways metaphysical insights, and perhaps maybe like faith that actually binds us together as a people, as being a part of that. And unfortunately, when you hear these people at like, the World Economic Forum talk, you just hear a bunch of technocrats. But perhaps maybe, I think, like you said, Trump kind of in a way waking up NATO. In some ways, people always talk about, they say, some people say, oh, there's some strategy here. Ultimately, it's like to wake NATO up. But perhaps maybe in a way, not only NATO, but Europe as well, to recognize, well, what is it that actually makes us a civilization?
Yeah. Well, something I say in the piece is that, if people were paying attention to the recent World Economic Forum speeches and meetings and all that stuff that happened in Davos last month, and we're recording, as you said, in early February, and that happened back in January. But, um, there definitely has been a sense over the last few years that among some people that there's this sort of that the world is like increasingly ruled by these like nameless, faceless, stateless, you know, childless, people who lack loyalty, like elites, right?
Can
Um,
we just mention Jeffrey Epstein because we're filming this literally a couple days after the release of more Epstein files, and I'll just say on my way home today I was listening to a Steve Bannon interview with Epstein, and Epstein keeps talking about the system.
yeah,
He's talking about the economy, but the system and all of these kind of like he talks about how they recognize how you can't necessarily rely upon a president or some kind of politician who's going to be in office for 4 years or maybe a little bit longer than that. But you have to have this kind of emergence of business and politics, together. And it will be those businessmen who always will kind of remain. And it's just, I mean, I
yeah,
think this will fuel a lot more of this discussion about, kind of like, well, it is just this kind of technocracy, really. And people will see all that talk about, like, if you want to say even something like what you said, Marshall talks about the regeneration of
yeah.
spirit as being just talk.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I don't want to be that cynical anymore, though. I mean, I'm prone to buying into the cynical view, certainly from time to time. I was kind of almost full blown during the worst of the COVID time, probably. But yeah, I mean, I'm very sympathetic to the idea of kind of that we're just sort of that it's all the machine now, the Jacques Ellul idea, and and that sort of thing. I am, but at the same time, what if it's not completely? I don't know. I mean, and it does seem to me that we're trying to focus on the theological virtue of hope, And I do think that it's not being totally Pollyanna-ish to kind of wonder if maybe we could, maybe not overnight, but at some point get to something more humane and that focuses indeed on that metaphysical ground. And, to go back to what I was saying before about kind of where it seemed just increasingly inevitable to a lot of people watching things like Davos year after year that like, oh, okay, that's where the world is run. None of this stuff out here matters. None of the voting, none of the whatever. But then step back and think about it. I mean, you have showing up at Davos, Karol Nawrocki, the president of Poland, who's saying very not Davos type stuff and has a platform to say it. You look at, I mean, there may be strife related to some of these questions, but you see populist movements becoming more and more popular in continental Europe. I mean, unless there is some incredible, kind of World Economic Forum, European Commission sort of sleight of hand, and that could happen. There was an article today in the European Conservative about how the EU may be implicated in rigging 8 different elections throughout, over the last few years or something. I mean, just crazy. Anyway, that's all preamble to say, I mean, it seems like the Alternative for Deutschland is probably going to get power at some point in Germany. There are these other populist movements and stuff, and all of these now maybe once they're in power, they'll just take over the apparatus and pull the levers of the machine instead. But it does seem like maybe there's a bit of a movement to say, you know what, we can just try something else. We really can.
Yeah.
And
And that's something else. I mean, I think it makes a lot of people really nervous. I mean, let's
yeah,
just take, the alternative for Germany. I mean, um, what's her name? Who's in charge of, or at least who's running that? I mean,
I don't
it's
know. I don't follow that
interesting.
closely, and I got in trouble with one of our listeners who thought I was, being woefully negligent by not knowing all the details about Alternative for
Well, I
Deutschland.
mean, it doesn't seem to me that that's necessarily the kind of like alternative that you want to.
No,
It's
but no,
very
not at
far
all.
from, yeah.
Yeah,
But it's interesting that, you have all these people projecting like, okay, well, what's the next thing? Obviously, there's a lot of signs that this thing is it's on its almost deathbed in a way.
yeah,
I do think that once, like with I mean, I still think that people there might be something like an awakening happening amongst a lot of younger people once the
yeah,
kind of things they feel like the so-called American dream might not be realized for them. There actually might be either you can just go down the road of total resentment and despair and then react to that, and that might be a real, like Max Shaler pointed out, resentment. I mean, really fuels a lot of the revolutionary spirit that went into some of these, even like the Bolshevik Revolution. But on
yeah,
the other hand, there might be like enough awareness to recognize the resentment that there needs to be something like the need for a savior and
yeah,
something that transcends that. So let's talk a little bit about that because when, the deeper unity that I think you're getting at in your the title of your piece. Let's just see here. Um, you seem to me to be pointing to an older concept that, seems to be like, I mean, people used it so many decades ago, even before World War II, and it kind of had a little bit of a revival maybe right after that, in the beginnings of the so-called Cold War. But some people see as actually maybe coming to an end in the 1500s, or maybe officially in 1648 in the Treaty of Westphalia. But
hmm
that's Christendom. So maybe we could
right.
talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I read people like T.S. Eliot and um, a lot of other 20th century thinkers, and I share their hope for the idea that there could be possibly some kind of renewal of a Christian imperium. Um, I don't know exactly how we get there. To back up to something that you were saying before, though, you know, I, my hope is that that people who are more maybe traditionally minded or something don't. despair and give up on the West as well. And I do feel like that is happening in some circles, which is actually one reason why I'm encouraged by somebody like the president of Poland kind of sticking up for NATO, why even somebody like Giorgia Meloni in Italy or Viktor Orban in Hungary, like not really making huge noise about leaving the EU. Like these they there's just maybe that's just kind of the institutionalist in me, just really would love to hang on to these institutions and reform them or use them as the basis for a kind of renewal of Christian imperium rather than, destroy them and then think we can create something new ex nihilo, which I think seems difficult. But yeah, I mean, we have centuries now of history since the real Christian imperium, anyway, at least in the West. And by the West, I mean basically not Russia here, because of course, there was the Great Schism and there was the separation of kind of, orthodoxy from Roman Catholicism, and that's another issue. But yeah, I mean, the late 16th and early 17th centuries in Western Europe, I mean, were just scandalous beyond comprehension. I mean, that Christians were killing each other in the thousands, for decades
Yeah.
after the Reformation.
I mean, the Thirty
You know,
Years' War was more devastating for the Germans than World War One. I mean,
right.
if you look at the proportion of people killed, I mean, it was completely devastating. Then you look at what happened in Poland, the deluge, the Swedish invasion of Poland was more devastating for the Poles than World War II was. So the 1600s is worth like taking a look at and saying, yeah, like how could that have come out of if you do, even though this is during the beginning of the Reformation, the 1500s is really like the kind of the height of this, like Christian Renaissance. That especially in the North, it's the time also of Michelangelo, and you just wonder how could that how could that be followed by such destruction?
Yeah,
So
I know. Yeah, exactly. And so it's no surprise that in the wake of all of that, um, well, one, you get the rise eventually of the nation state. And so then like the idea then is like nations then have to have their own, we're not anymore thinking about a loyalty that's higher than that in a sense. Except maybe if you're two Catholic countries, you sort of have kind of some sort of agreement, something, but probably not even then. So you have the nation state, but then you also have like a sort of a change in the kind of worldview, which is explicitly about a common ground that is not rooted in revealed religion, right? So it's like, and in the sense, like the Voltaires of the world or whatever, are just like, sort of saying like, you want to do better, Christianity? You didn't, you're not, so we're gonna try something else, and so where does that leave us now? I don't know. I mean, I think it leaves us in on the one hand like a kind of naive position where we have thought wrongly for decades now that we can just be neutral on the questions of what is the ultimate meaning of everything,
Mhm.
which is what a strange thought, or that is. And then moreover, you know, that we've thought we whatever it means to be European or American for that matter is necessarily detached from the historical kind of um, reference point, to the extent that now like you could be a Muslim mayor of London, or whatever, like all these kinds of things, which I mean, we'll see how it all plays out. But I mean, it does seem like we're sort of trying to live um, in a, you know, in an impossibility.
Mhm.
And so I don't know. I mean, I wonder if we can get sort of some of those questions answered and still live with the kind of ambiguity of Catholic, Protestant, a certain number of non-believers, that sort of thing. I kind of hope so, because that's kind of there is common ground to be shared, even among people who have sort of different confessional um, commitments. but it's tough. But the fact that it's tough doesn't mean it's something we shouldn't think about, talk about, and indeed attempt.
Yeah. It's I was looking at there's a guy named Aaron Wrenn and he does all of these. He's a Protestant. And he's had some pretty insightful like articles over the years about, kind of these different turning points, if you want to say, in at least recent American history. But he posted this chart on X of like, okay, like the past, the present moment, and then he kind of was projecting into speculating about the future, and at least he had one little spot for the kind of the spirituality of the future, and he puts re-enchantment question mark. Now, I know that like that term re-enchantment is being thrown around today all the time, where it basically, I mean, it's almost kind of become this, yeah, this just term that could mean anything. But it's interesting that I always keep, whenever somebody talks about the re-enchantment and saying, oh, maybe we'll be looking at some pagan kind of older, you have some people even in Poland here, I see some people wearing like these old pagan Slavic symbols. And you hear about some people like in the Nordic countries returning to, some of the Viking beliefs. But I always think of that David Bentley Hart article going way back in First Things about, Christ or nothing. It's like you can't really believe that it almost becomes something like a boutique thing that you're play acting, and you just can't take that quite seriously. And I think also that like that play acting, you can find that in some of these Catholic circles as well, in the reenchantment. But I do think that generally, that hopefully in the next couple like generations, it seems like the 1054 schism may actually we will. I know we've already in Vatican II have worked out a lot of that stuff, but there might be this coming together again of the East and the West. At least a lot of my students from Ukraine actually hope so. They actually today they were talking about 1054, and I was surprised they know about the 1054 schism because I've never talked about that before. But it brought to mind too, somebody who mentions this a lot is Michel Welbach, who talks a lot about the West. And he goes back to the problem of 1054. In fact, that's mentioned in the book the book by Georgius on the West. He mentions Michel Welbeck near the end of that book, um, as kind of being an interesting, interlocutor with somebody who, in some ways, is living in the nihilism, perceives it as the nihilism is longing for something more, but is quite not sure what that is.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think, Andrew, I know we're kind of getting close to time here. But like, could we, I mean, this you mentioned in your piece the Warsaw speech, the famous Trump Warsaw speech. And a lot of people, I think you might have mentioned this, like that some people are wondering whether or not that Trump, you know, part one is still there with Trump part two. And I really do believe that to be the case. But I actually was in Poland when he gave that speech. And I remember my brother-in-law called me immediately right after the speech and said, "Oh my gosh, that was like one of the best things I've ever heard." And the fact that he chose his first trip to Europe to be in Warsaw was quite an interesting statement. So yeah, maybe could you say a little bit about that as well?
Well, something I should preface it by saying you have pointed out to me that maybe sometimes Americans and others kind of overstate the piety of Polish society, maybe in some ways. But that said, Poland does have a kind of legacy of faith, which is remarkably much stronger in the year 2026 than many other European countries, most other European countries, right?
Yeah.
So that's really
I mean,
significant.
mass is still packed.
Yeah,
It is quite something. And these are just little frustrations, every now and then,
right.
you kind of like sometimes you may think that having a line at the bus stop is just essential, forming a line is part of being Catholic, and then you recognize actually the line is very unique to America and maybe, England.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I,
Yeah.
I gotta be careful not to condemn a whole society as like not Catholic because they might cut you off to go on to the bus. As a student told me, well, Mr. Mixa, I was complaining about that there's no line when you wait for the bus stop, and the student said, well, Mr. Mixa, you just got to improve your skill at getting on the bus.
Yeah.
It's a
Yeah.
skill to improve. There's no injustice when you're
Yeah.
waiting there for, half an hour and the person who just shows up takes the last seat. But I thought that
Yeah.
was quite funny. But yes, there's still this like if you want to say there's an expression here, uh, a guest at home is God at home. The hospitality, most people talk about that, and I don't think that is accidental to I don't think I think that is related to the Catholicism and the culture.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, Trump said in his speech in 2017, your nation is great because your spirit is great and your spirit is strong.
Yeah.
And I think maybe another way to think about that is just, I mean, Poland, there is in recent memory the realization of not being a nation, but yet being one, right? Being a
Yeah.
people, but being dominated by other imperial powers, but enduring through not only decades, but centuries, as a matter of fact, and understanding through it all that it is their faith that is really the ground of that unity.
Yeah.
Now, part of me wonders whether it's really hard to put the toothpaste back in the tube, when faith has kind of been lost to some degree. At the same time, there does seem to be at least a little bit of a movement in places like France or Italy or somewhere like that, which is to say, basically, if we're going to continue to be France, what makes that what it is?
Mhm.
Like these abstract principles that could like any literally anybody could be living in that building over there doing literally anything and it's equally French.
Mhm.
I mean, no, that isn't the case. Like and the historic faith, of our ancestors is criterion number one for what that could be. So, I mean, in that sense, I think that renewal is I think it's at least going to be attempted in certain communities, in certain places, and hopefully that influence will grow. I mean, it doesn't take that many people when you think in terms of like the number of people in a country, right? Like it doesn't take that many people to do something and get noticed to then have an effect on the larger whole. So I think there's reasons for hope. And maybe I'm naive or outmoded or something like that to just continue to think that it's good and worthwhile to keep pegging this Western unity to organizations like NATO or whatever. But I'm just going to keep doing it. I think that these alliances were forged for a reason and they have their flaws and their absurdities, frankly, at times. But they also exist or have existed or should have existed for some nobler purpose than just kind of, well, let's just try not to blow each other up or something. Yeah, let's definitely try not to blow each other up, but there's more.
Yeah. Well, there's so much to talk about. And I mean, we'll be devoting a lot more podcasts on this theme since this is what we're very much about. But also kind of, yeah, transcending this from being just a kind of political concern but to getting into these metaphysical, theological grounds that is rooted in the great hope, as Pope Benedict said. So just a couple updates here. We just want to mention that we encourage everybody to consider making a donation to the Space Solving Institute. This year, we actually, last year we got the 501c3 status, and we're able to take donations to support the work that we do. Andrew and I, we both are fully employed right now, but any type of help is much appreciated. And we really plan this year on we have all these talks planned out. We have a webinar that we hope to have soon and also an event in Krakow and perhaps maybe in Dallas as well. And any support would be much appreciated. And then also too, we encourage you to comment on the YouTube videos. It's always good to hear from you what you think, if you disagree, if you agree. It's just, we love engaging with our audience. In fact, actually, to be honest, the disagreements, I love it because sometimes there's a point that maybe we didn't articulate the best way, or maybe just a flat out disagreement. To see that actually there's a whole like diverse crowd out there listening to us. So we love hearing your opinion. Please submit any comment on YouTube. But I want to thank you for your loyalty to the podcast. I think Andrew and I we're doing something quite unique, and we'd like to continue this and to see it grow. Um, so Andrew, thank you for. It's always good to talk to you. And we'll have a few more of these planned in the upcoming weeks.